Do you think AI, when it's deployed by companies like Microsoft and Google and Meta, will have the same issue of being weirdly corporate? Like there'd be some uncanny valley, some weirdness to the whole presentation. So I've gotten a chance to talk to George Hotz. He believes everything should be open source and decentralized. And then we shall have the AI of the people. And it'll maintain a grounding to the magic that's humanity, that's the human condition. That like corporations will destroy the magic.
I believe that if we make everything open source and make this mandatory, we are going to lose about a lot of beautiful art and a lot of beautiful designs. There is a reason why Linux desktop is still ugly, right? And it's
Strong
because
words
it's difficult
from Joscha
to create coherence in open source designs so far when the designs have to get very large, and it's easier to make this happening in a company with centralized organization. And from my own perspective, what we should ensure is that open source never dies, that it can always compete and has a place with the other forms of organization, because I think it is absolutely vital that open source exists and that we have systems that people have under control outside of the corporation, and that is also producing viable competition to the corporations.
So the corporations, the centralized control, the dictatorships of corporations can create beauty. Because centralized design is a source of a lot of beauty. Yeah. And then I guess open source is a source of freedom, a hedge against the corrupting nature of power that comes with centralized.
I grew up in socialism, and yes. I learned that corporations are totally evil, and I found this very, very convincing. And then you look at corporations like Enron and Halliburton maybe and realize, yeah, they are evil. Mm-hmm. But you also notice that many other corporations are not evil. Mm-hmm. They're surprisingly benevolent. Mm-hmm. Why are they so benevolent? Is this because everybody is fighting them all the time? I don't think that's the only explanation. It's because they're actually animals that live in a large ecosystem and that are still largely controlled by people that want that ecosystem to flourish and be viable for people. So I think that Pat Gelsinger is completely sincere when he leads Intel to be a tool that supplies the free world with semiconductors. And it's not necessary that all the semiconductors are coming from Intel. It just Intel needs to be there to make sure that we always have them. Right, so there can be many ways in which we can import and trade semiconductors from other companies and places. We just need to make sure that nobody can cut us off from it, because that would be a disaster for this kind of society and world. Right, and so there are many things that need to be done to make our style of life possible. And then with this, I don't mean just capitalism, environmental destruction, consumerism, and creature comforts. I mean an idea of life in which we are determined not by some kind of king or dictator, but in which individuals can determine themselves to the largest possible degree. And to me, this is something that this Western world is still trying to embody. And it's a very valuable idea that we shouldn't give up too early. And from this perspective, the US is a system of interleaving clubs. And an entrepreneur is a special club founder. It's somebody who makes a club that is producing things that are economically viable. And to do this, it requires a lot of people who are dedicating a significant part of their life for working for this particular kind of club. And the entrepreneur is picking the initial set of rules and the mission and vision and aesthetics for the club and make sure that it works. But the people that are in there need to be protected, right? If they sacrifice part of their life, there need to be rules that tell how they're being taken care of even after they leave the club and so on. So there's a large body of rules that have been created by our rule-giving clubs and that are enforced by our enforcement clubs and so on. And some of these clubs have to be monopolies for game theoretic reasons, which also makes them more open to corruption and less harder to update. Yeah. And this is an ongoing discussion and process that takes place. But the beauty of this idea that there is no centralized king who is that is extracting from the peasants and breeding the peasants into serving the king and fulfilling all the roles like ants in an anthill. But that there is a freedom of association, and corporations are one of them, is something that took me some time to realize. So I do think that corporations are dangerous, right? They need to be protections against overreach of corporations that can do regulatory capture and prevent open source from competing with corporations by imposing rules that make it impossible for a small group of kids to come together to build their own language model, because OpenAI has convinced the US that you need to have some kind of FDA process that you need to go through that costs many $millions before you are able to train a language model. Right? So this is important to make sure that this doesn't happen. So I think that OpenAI and Google are good things. If these good things are kept in check in such a way that all the other clubs can still be founded and all the other forms of clubs that are desirable can still coexist with them.
So what do you think about Meta in contrast to that, open sourcing most of its language models and most of the AI models it's working on, and actually suggesting that they will continue to do so in the future for future versions of Llama, for example, their large language model? What is that exciting to you? Is that concerning?
I don't find it very concerning, but that's also because I think that the language models are not very dangerous yet. And
Yet.
Yes. So as I said, I have no proof that there is a boundary between the language models and AI, AGI. It's possible that somebody builds a version of baby AGI, I think, and throws in algorithmic improvements that scale these systems up in ways that otherwise wouldn't have happened without these language model components. So it's not really clear for me what the end game is there, and if these models can brute force their way into AGI. And there's also a possibility that the AGI that we are building with these language models are not taking responsibility for what they are because they don't understand the greater game. And so to me, it would be interesting to try to understand how to build systems that understand what the greater games are. What are the longest games that we can play on this planet?
Games broadly, like deeply defined the way you did with the games.
In the game theoretic sense. So when we are interacting with each other, in some sense, we are playing games. We are making lots and lots of interactions. And this doesn't mean that these interactions have all to be transactional. Every one of us is playing some kind of game by virtue of identifying with particular kinds of goals that we have or aesthetics from which we derive the goals. Right? So when you say, I'm Lex Fridman, I'm doing a set of podcasts, then you feel that it's part of something larger that you want to build. Maybe you want to inspire people. Maybe you want them to see more possibilities and get them together over shared ideas. Maybe your game is that you want to become super rich and famous by being the best podcaster on earth. Maybe you have other games. Maybe it switches from time to time, right? But there is a certain perspective where you might be thinking, what is the longest possible game that you could be playing? A short game is, for instance, cancer is playing a shorter game than your organism. Cancer is an organism playing a shorter game than the regular organism. And because the cancer cannot procreate beyond the organism, except for some infectious cancers, like the ones that eradicated the Tasmanian devils, you typically end up with a situation where the organism dies together with the cancer, because the cancer has destroyed the larger system due to playing a shorter game. And so ideally, you want to, I think, build agents that play the longest possible games. And the longest possible games is to keep entropy at bay as long as possible while doing interesting stuff.
But the longest, yes, that part, the longest possible game while doing interesting stuff, and while maintaining at least the same amount of interesting.
Yes.
So complexity, so propagating.
Currently, I'm pretty much identified as a conscious being. It's the minimal identification that I managed to get together. Because if I turn this off, I fall asleep. Right? And when I'm asleep, I'm a vegetable. I'm no longer here as an agent. So my agency is basically predicated on being conscious. And what I care about is other conscious agents. They're the only moral agents for me. And so if an AI were to treat me as a moral agent that it is interested in coexisting with and cooperating with and mutually supporting each other, maybe it is, I think, necessary that the AI thinks that consciousness is a viable mode of existence and important. So I think it would be very important to build conscious AI and do this as the primary goal. So not just say we want to build a useful tool that we can use for all sorts of things, and then we have to make sure that the impact on the labor market is something that is not too disruptive and manageable, and the impact on the copyright holder is manageable and not too disruptive, and so on. Right? I don't think that's the most important game to be played. I think that we will see extremely large disruptions of the status quo that are quite unpredictable at this point. And I just personally want to make sure that some of the stuff on the other side is interesting and conscious.
How do we ride as individuals and as a society this wave, disruptive wave that changes the nature of the game?
I absolutely don't know. So everybody is going to do their best, as always.
Do we build a bunker in the woods? Do we meditate more? Drugs, so mushrooms, psychedelics. I mean, what? Lots of sex. What are we talking about here? Do you play Diablo 4? I'm hoping that will help me escape for a brief moment. Play video games? What? Do you have ideas?
I really liked playing Disco Elysium. It was one of the most beautiful computer games I played in recent years. And it's a noir novel that is a philosophical perspective on Western society from the perspective of an Estonian. And he first of all wrote a book about this world that is a parallel universe that is quite poetic and fascinating and is condensing his perspective on our societies. It was very, very nice. He spent a lot of time writing it. He had, I think, sold a couple thousand books, and as a result became an alcoholic. And then he had the idea, or one of his friends had the idea of turning this into an RPG. Mm-hmm. And it's mind-blowing. They spent, the illustrator, more than a year just on making the art for the scenes in between. And
so aesthetically, it captures you, pulls you
stunning. But it's a philosophical work of art. It's a reflection of society. It's fascinating to spend time in this world. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it was using a medium in a new way and telling a story that left me enriched. Mm-hmm. Well, when I tried Diablo, I didn't feel enriched playing it. I felt that the time playing it was not unpleasant, but there's also more pleasant stuff that I can do in that time. So ultimately, I feel that I'm being gamed. I'm not gaming.
Oh, the addiction thing.
Yes, I basically feel that there is a very transparent economy that's going on. The story of Diablo was brain dead. So it's not really interesting to me.
My heart is slowly breaking by the deep truth you're conveying to me. Why can't you just allow me to enjoy my personal
by all
addiction?
means, go nuts. I have no objection here. I'm just trying to describe what's happening, and it's not that I don't do things that I later say, oh, I wish I would have done something different.
Yeah.
I also know that when we die, the greatest regret that people typically have on their deathbed is say, oh, I wish I had spent more time on Twitter. No, I don't think that's the case. I think I should probably have spent less time on Twitter, but I found it so useful for myself and also so addictive that I felt I need to make the best of it and turn it into an art form and thought form. Mm-hmm. And it did help me to develop something.
Yeah.
But I wish what other things I could have done in the meantime. It's just not the universe that we are in anymore. Most people don't read books anymore.
What do you think that means, that we don't read books anymore? What do you think that means about the collective intelligence of our species? Is it possible it's still progressing and growing?
Well, it clearly is. There is stuff happening on Twitter that was impossible with books. Yeah. And I really regret that Twitter has not taken the turn that I was hoping for. I thought Elon is global brain-pilled and understands that this thing needs to self-organize, and he needs to develop tools to allow the profligation of the self-organization so Twitter can become sentient. And maybe this was a pipe dream from the beginning, but I felt that the enormous pressure that he was under made it impossible for him to work on any kind of content goals. And also many of the decisions that he made under this pressure seemed to be not very wise. I don't think that as a CEO of a social media company, you should have opinions in the culture war in public. I think that's very short-sighted. And I also suspect that it's not a good idea to block Paul Graham of all people over setting a Mastodon link. And I think Paul made this intentionally because he wanted to show Elon Musk that blocking people for setting a link is completely counter to any idea of free speech that he intended to bring to Twitter. And basically, seeing that Elon was way less principled in his thinking there and is much more experimental. And many of the things that he is trying, they pan out very differently in a digital society than they pan out in a car company, because the effect is very different, because everything that you do in a digital society is going to have real world cultural effects. And so basically I find it quite regrettable that this guy is able to become de facto the Pope, right? Twitter has more active members than the Catholic Church. And he doesn't get it. The power and responsibility that he has, and the ability to create something in a society that is lasting and that is producing a digital agora in a way that has never existed before, where we build a social network on top of a social network, an actual society on top of the algorithms. So this is something that is hope still in the future and still in the cards. But it's something that exists in small parts. I find that the corner of Twitter that I'm in is extremely pleasant. It's just when I take a few steps outside of it, it is not very wholesome anymore. And the way in which people interact with strangers suggests that it's not a civilized society yet.
So as the number of people who follow you on Twitter expands, you feel the burden of the uglier sides of humanity.
Yes, but there's also a similar thing in the normal world. That is, if you become more influential, if you have more status, if you have more fame in the real world, you get lots of perks, but you also have way less freedom in the way in which you interact with people, especially with strangers, because a certain percentage of people, it's a small single-digit percentage, is nuts and dangerous, and the more of those are looking at you, the more of them might get ideas.
But what if the technology enables you to discover the majority of people, to discover and connect efficiently and regularly with the majority of people who are actually really good? I mean, one of my sort of concerns with a platform like Twitter is there's a lot of really smart people out there, a lot of smart people that disagree with me and with others between each other. And I love that if the technology would bring those to the top, the beautiful disagreements, like intelligence squared type of debates. There's a bunch of, one of my favorite things to listen to is arguments, and arguments like high effort arguments with the respect and love underneath it. But then it gets a little too heated, but that kind of too heated, which I've seen you participate in. And I love that with Lee Cronin, with those kinds of folks. And you go pretty hard. Like you get frustrated, but it's all beautiful.
With Lee, I can do this because we know each other.
Yes.
And Lee has the rare gift of being willing to be wrong in public.
Yeah.
So basically he has thoughts that are as wrong as the random thoughts of an average highly intelligent person, but he blurts them out while not being sure if they're right. And he enjoys doing that. And once you understand that this is his game, you don't get offended by him saying something that you think is so wrong.
But he's constantly passively communicating a respect for the people he's talking with, and for just basic humanity and truth and all that kind of stuff. And there's a self-deprecating thing. There's a bunch of like social skills you acquire that allow you to be a great debater, a great argumenter, like be wrong in public and explore ideas together in public when you disagree. And if I would love for Twitter to elevate those folks, elevate those kinds of conversations.
It already does in some sense. But also if it elevates them too much, then you get this phenomenon in Clubhouse where you always get dragged on stage. And I found this very stressful because it was too intense.
Yeah.
I don't like to be dragged on stage all the time.
Yeah.
I think once a week is enough. Yeah. And also when I met Lee the first time, I found that a lot of people seemed to be shocked by the fact that he was being very aggressive with their results, that he didn't seem to show a lot of sensibility in the way in which he was criticizing what they were doing and being dismissive of the work of others. And that was not, I think, in any way a shortcoming of him, because I noticed that he was much, much more dismissive with respect to his own work. It was his general stance. And I felt that this general stance is creating a lot of liability for him, because really a lot of people take offense at him being not like a Dale Carnegie character who's always smooth and make sure that everybody likes him. So I really respect that he is willing to take that risk and to be wrong in public and to offend people. And he doesn't do this in any bad way. It's just most people feel, or not all people recognize this. Mm-hmm. And so I can be much more aggressive with him than I can be with many other people who don't play the same game, because he understands the way and the spirit in which I respond to him.
I think that's a fun and that's a beautiful game. It's ultimately a productive one.